Grace, mercy, and peace belong to you. They are free gifts from the one who was and is to come. This morning, I want to share a story with you about a man who was ambushed by Jesus and why it matters to you. Last week, we spoke of the value of sharing stories with one another through witnessing and confessing and testifying, so that by experiencing the interconnectedness of our lives, we might begin to see a clearer picture of God. Today, I want to expand the idea of storytelling in the hope that you can come to see through the eyes of someone who is surprised by God that it is not we who are the primary actors in the narrative of our lives, but rather it is God who is the main actor. The villain turned hero of the story which Sharon just shared is Saul of Tarsus. He's the preeminent defender of Jewish tradition in the first century. Today, we would say he was a royal pain in the you-know-what, and the chief prosecutor of those who followed the way, or the path of the new risen Messiah, this crucified, now alive Jesus. Now, even if you're not familiar with this story, one of the most famous in the Bible, actually, chances are you've at least heard of a road to Damascus conversion. Meaning not so much a religious change of heart as some kind of dramatic 180-degree turnaround in someone's life. One day someone is this way, and then the next morning they're completely the opposite, and you're scratching your head wondering, what the heck happened to him? Allow me to condense the storyline as we begin. Saul is a member of the Pharisees, which was a strict, puritanical Jewish sect. He's a university-trained legal scholar, and he emerges in the decade or so after the crucifixion as a leader of those who want to stamp out this upstart movement which claims Jesus is the long-predicted Messiah. At one point, we even read that Saul held the coats of the mob that stoned Stephen, who was generally recognized as the first Christian martyr, stoned him to death. And now, as we pick up the story, Saul's traveling to Damascus, modern-day Syria, to round up more of these new believers for prosecution and punishment and probably prison. And that's where Saul is ambushed by Jesus. The three different accounts in Acts, the story is repeated 3 different times. And even Paul's own letters all differ on the details, but the picture is one of a blinding light being knocked to the ground and a voice, that of Jesus according to the story, asking, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, while we don't know exactly what happened, did Saul actually see Jesus? What did he hear and how did he hear it? All we know for sure is that something dramatic happened that day. Something happened that day to turn this fellow who was a religious zealot into a new believer who suddenly understood the reality of this Jesus whom he had denied. Something happened in one literal blinding moment that not only changed one fellow's life, but forever the future of Western civilization along with it. This is one of those rare benchmarks in history. And in the matter of a few short years, through the mid-50s, more or less, of the first century, Saul became Paul, the new apostle of the risen Lord, founder of a handful of churches in Greece and Asia Minor. Read that, Turkey. And the power of his letters to those new communities form the basis of the New Testament. And something you may not realize, that nearly all of Paul's letters were written before the first gospel was written. And in the 2 centuries that followed Paul's 7 trips around the Mediterranean basin, back and forth between Greece and Turkey, this new Christian faith went from being a religion of heretics to the officially sanctioned religion of the known world. All because one man was ambushed by Jesus. Now, Saul's conversion moment, however it happened, wasn't something he decided to do on his own that eventful day. I think I'm just going to get up and get converted today. It's not how it worked. This was God's own doing. You know, many of us are or have been surprised by God in some way, but most of us don't have such a bolt of lightning moment like Saul's. That moment when we discover, and we hadn't realized it until this point, that God is in our life. For most of us, the experience is more like a dry sponge getting wet, drip by drip by drip, until one day we wake up and realizing that we're saturated with God's directing presence. And we don't know how it happened. We just know that it is. Now Luke, who is the author of Acts, tells the story of Paul's conversion not to show us what a typical conversion should look like, but to convince you and me or anyone else that absolutely anyone is capable of being surprised by the relentless grace of God. No one is beyond God's reach. Eugene Peterson says the narrative of God's ambush underscores the element of surprise in our expectation of what God can do. We tend to define God by what we can handle up here, and that's way too limiting for the creator of the universe. God's sudden and surprising invasion into Saul, about to become Paul's life, is illustrative of the radical nature of God. The God who in effect says, what better way to persuade people of the truth of the good news than to pick this guy who's the most opposed to my message? And that is what he did. This ambush suggests that no one is beyond the grace of God, and indeed that it is in the great economy of God's amazing grace that all is made new and transformed. Nothing is wasted. No past experience is wasted. I love what the great Irish scoundrel and playwright and poet and novelist Oscar Wilde said about this story. See where you fit in this sentence. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. And however it is that we manage to come to our senses, we suddenly accept the past is over, and it's done with, and we look to the future. And all we can say, as Frederick Buechner describes the occasion, is wow. Wow. And Paul, you'll notice, after his wow moment, never once looked back. When we read this passage from Acts in such a way as Oscar Wilde imagines it, we no longer take in a story about a religious conversion that happened to someone so long ago we can't even fathom it. It becomes instead a story about what God can do with a person that most of us might regard as beyond God's grace and salvation. This is where this improbable story becomes your story. Have you ever said that about someone? I know I have. They're just beyond saving. Or had someone say that about you? Well, she's just hopeless. She'll never amount to anything. Maybe, just maybe, the lesson of this story of ambush is that God wants to teach you and me that God's just waiting in God's own inimitable, unique timing to turn the page on that person's script and create an entirely new storyline. In every play and in every novel, even in every song, there's a point where the story turns. And that pivotal point is whenever it wants to be. You can't force it, but you have to be able to recognize it through the grace of the Spirit when it happens. Maybe, just maybe, it's how we regard one another that can be the blinding moment of transformation, the dying of the old self to a new self and a wholly resurrected life. Maybe we all need to think twice about how easily we judge one another. I want you to notice, too, the role of Ananias in the story. The voice that the blinded Saul hears directs him to be guided into the city of Damascus and to wait there for this fellow Ananias, one of the new disciples of the church. Ananias is supposed to lay hands on him and restore his sight. But when Ananias gets wind of what God's asking him to do, he says, oh, wait a minute, I heard about this guy. He's heard of Saul's reputation and wants nothing to do with this disastrous zealot. But ever the faithful one, Ananias finally relents to the vision from God, and the rest of the story is history. As I was saying this, the face of my now deceased friend Will Campbell, who was a Southern Baptist preacher, flashed into my mind. Will Campbell was one of the leaders of the early civil rights movement in the 60s. He was the only white person in the room when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed. So he was a hero of the African American population in the South. But one day, his neighbor, who happened to be the Grand Quack, or whatever the title they gave to the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, his son was dying. I don't remember what the illness was, but Will went to visit him. Sat on the porch, drinking whiskey in a rocking chair, and praying for this man, who became the Ananias of the civil rights movement. This is another point of entry for us into this ancient story, for two reasons. First, it teaches that sometimes we have to set aside what our mind wants us to do and follow instead the voice of that inner heart that says, I know this doesn't make any sense, but I'm asking you to do it anyway. I'm asking you to take a chance. So what about you? Have you ever taken a chance on someone you weren't sure about? Or have you ever not taken a chance and wished you had? Maybe you've been burned before. Once is enough. But forgiveness can be a powerful remedy for outrageous behavior, as my friend Will Campbell found out. Ananias appears to be just an ordinary Christian, an average Joe, who demonstrates extraordinary courage and faithfulness, the kind of forgiving posture that is so lost in today's world of rigid moralism, and especially in this year of false political piety. From this one act of obedience by Ananias, this one forgiving moment, forgiveness from a man Saul doesn't even know. Saul emerges as Paul, a forgiven and reborn man, a man about to change the face of the world for Christ forever. We began last week's lesson, and I conclude this one with an emphasis on how sharing stories with one another builds connectedness with one another, and in turn connects us all to the God that we seek. The truth of this observation lies in the testimony of all four Gospels, which say in various ways that to be a Christian is to objectively know that we share the same identity that Jesus enjoyed as being both human and divine. The Franciscan Richard Rohr says this realization that someone is living in us and through us is exactly how we plug into a much larger mind and heart beyond our own. The greatness isn't out there somewhere, folks. It's in here, where God lives. Well, you may never really be ambushed as Saul was. Is it so hard to believe that God will always find ways to enter into our lives and hearts, turning our attention away from old angers, old prejudices, feeling of loss, old convictions, old conclusions that are written on the stone of our hearts, and open our souls to a new way, God's new way of seeing. Whether you're ever blessed to experience a road to Damascus conversion, or whether you are a dry sponge waiting to be wet, know from this amazing story of ambush that the God you so desperately seek is within your heart and soul, waiting to be found by you. And when that moment happens, my prayer is that you never be the same. So may God guide you this day and this week for the rest of your life on your journey toward always being open to surprise. Amen.